So on page, in section 15.3, Duff is giving you some tools to narrow down what the parsing of a verb is going to be. And so he points out that in the indicative mood, in the present tense, no matter what voice it is, active, middle, or passive, and remember that middle and passive are the same in the present tense, you just have the stem, the present stem of the verb. In the future, for active and middle indicative, you have a sigma between the stem and the ending. And for the passive in the future, you have a theta eta sigma. In the imperfect, in the indicative, in all three voices, you have an epsilon augment and nothing between the stem and the ending. And in aorist, in the indicative, you have, of course, an epsilon augment. And in the active and middle, you have a sigma. And in the passive, which is different, you have a theta. And then you have other moods. So what he's pointing out here is that the indicative has some things that are similar, and you can immediately recognize those. And then for infinitives, for imperatives, and for participles, there's also things that tell you, well, it's going to be one of those three. And now I just have to look at the ending to figure out which of those three. So in the present tense, for whether it's an infinitive, an imperative, or a participle, you're just going to have the present tense stem. And in the aorist, again, for the infinitive, the imperative, and the participle, you're not going to have an augment, of course. And then you're going to have a sigma for the active or middle and a theta for the passive. So that's going to help you to narrow down what it is that you're dealing with when you have a verb. So if we turn the page and look at practice 15.3, that's all Duff is asking you to do, is narrow it down. Now I'm going to take you through these verbs and parse them completely, but if you're looking at his answers and confused about what he's doing, that's what he's doing. He's just asking you to narrow them down. So in number one, we have the verb pisteuo. And if you know that the lexical form is pisteuo, then you recognize the stem here, pisteu, and the epsilon augment is there. So again, the epsilon augment immediately tells you that this is an indicative verb. So we can write that down right off the bat. And then what kind of an ending, what kind of a letter do we have in between the stem and the ending? Well, we have this theta. And if you look at your list, you'll see that if you have a stem with an epsilon augment and an eta, that must be the aorist passive. And so we're going to say, okay, aorist passive. And just so you know, this is the third person singular ending. Here we have the verb pempo. And we have the stem. And we notice that there's no epsilon augment, but we have evidence here that a sigma has been added. So again, if we look back on our chart and ask, well, when is it that we have a stem with no augment and a sigma? Well, we see that must be the aorist, active or middle, in one of the other moods. In fact, this is an imperative, and we know this from the ending, aorist, active, second plural. Here we have the verb lambano. And so we see the stem, lamban. You might remember that lambano has a second aorist. And so we're going to be recognizing here that this is the present stem. We have an epsilon augment, and we have nothing in particular in between the stem and the ending. And so that tells us that it's the imperfect. And so we have the indicative. Because of the augment, we know that it must be indicative. We have imperfect, has nothing between the stem and the ending. And then this is the active, third person singular. And then here we have the verb arkomai. This is a deponent verb, and we see here that we have no augment, but we have evidence of a sigma being added. If we have no augment and a sigma being added, I think up here I mentioned that this was an other mood, but the other possibility, of course, is that it can be future. And in this case, based on the ending, this is a future tense of arkomai. And the way we're going to parse it for this class is we're going to parse it as the indicative future. And here we're going to put a D for deponent. So whenever you come across a deponent verb in the voice, go ahead and put deponent, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, what that means as far as meaning goes. And then the atai ending is a third person singular. All right, so let me put up the next four, and then we'll keep going. All right, the next four forms, we have apoluthe sontai. This comes from the verb apoluo. And so here we have this stem, which we see right here. And then we have this really long ending, which has the theta eta sigma, and there's no epsilon augment. Theta eta sigma tells you right away that this is a future passive. And so this is going to be indicative, future passive, and the ending there is third person plural. This verb is logizomai. So it's a deponent verb. The fact that the lexical form ends in omai is what tells you it's a deponent verb. And what we have here is evidence that a sigma has been added to the stem. And so we have evidence of a sigma with no augment. That could either be a future tense or it could be an aorist in one of the other moods according to our chart. But if we recognize the asthai ending, then we realize that this is actually an infinitive, and it's an infinitive aorist. And the sigma there tells us about the aorist. And then this is a deponent verb. And with an infinitive, we don't get person and number. That's all we have to say. This verb is poieo. The eta is evidence of this epsilon extending, and then we have this theta, and we have no augment. So if we have a theta with no augment, then that tells us it must be an aorist passive in some other mood. And if we look at the ending, this is actually an imperative aorist passive, and it's a second person plural ending. This verb is miseo. Again, we have this epsilon in the stem that's going to extend to the eta, so that explains that little bit. But we have an epsilon augment, and we have a sun ending. We might recognize that as the indicative aorist. Certainly with an epsilon augment, we know it's indicative. And we have the aorist ending. This is just a regular active ending in the third person plural. So that's all the verbs in practice 15.3. We'll talk a little bit more about meanings and about more complicated verbs in the next video.